Hello and welcome to the Atoll, your home for Waterworld fandom. On this channel, we look into all things Waterworld and uncover amazing discoveries about this cult sci-fi action-adventure film franchise. In this video, we will be investigating everything we know about the many video game tie-ins to Waterworld. You may be very surprised by just how many Waterworld video games there are, both released and unreleased, so let's jump right in. Let's first take a look at the officially released video games of Waterworld that came out at the time of the film's release. All of these were published by the British game development company Ocean Software Limited, which at the time was snapping up the rights to many movie and television licensed games, such as RoboCop, Batman, The Addams Family, Hook, Darkman, The Flintstones, Short Circuit, Lethal Weapon, Jurassic Park, and The Untouchables. Up first is the Super NES version of Waterworld. In this game, you play as the mariner who has decided that it is his duty to protect the Atollers against the raiding smokers and to save Enola from the Deacon. The game alternates between three different styles of gameplay. In one, you pilot the trimaran and do battle with smoker boats, jet skis, and seaplanes while protecting a central atoll and its inhabitants from being abducted, which affects the final score in these sections. Also, side note, these sections have renderings of rock outcroppings and the tops of skyscrapers. Do these qualify as dry land? The next style of gameplay finds you swimming among the underwater ruins of the ancients, collecting items and pre-packaged bags of dirt. The mariner must navigate through the maze of the submerged cities while avoiding eels and stingrays, and make it to the surface before the timer runs out. Or does this red bar represent how long he can hold his breath for? However, that wouldn't make sense since the mariner can breathe underwater, so it is perhaps a timer like the one used at the beginning of the film, or maybe it's simply the energy level of the swimming mariner. Regardless, the items collected are exchanged into credits, though it is a shame that they did not use the in-universe monetary system of chits here. The credits can be used in the shop to repair and upgrade your trimaran. And by the way, I have always loved the pre-rendered 3D graphics of the shop. I mean, just look at this guy.
Thanks.
The third style of gameplay has you running, jumping, and climbing through the atolls with platform-style action. The mariner can acquire various firearms and slash with his machete to take down smokers. Once all the smokers are eliminated in these areas, the section ends. Though, finding all the smokers cannot always be obvious, and sometimes getting onto ladders can be very precarious. Each stage of the game, of which there are 8 in total, basically follows the same structure of smoker ambush, dive for items, atoll defense, and smoker elimination. At the end of each stage, you are rewarded with a code that will allow you to start from that point again if you are to fail in the upcoming stage. The final stage culminates with a duel against the Deacon himself aboard the D's, and the game ends with this glorious splash screen of the trimaran approaching dry land. Surprisingly, the Super NES Waterworld game was only released in PAL regions and never came to the United States. One last note about this game is how incredible the music is. Composed by Dean Evans, the tracks still have a cult following on the internet today. Even my opening animation is set to the track called Map, and just have a listen to this track called Diving. Thank you, Dean Evans. Subscribe to his channel if you haven't already. Up next is the Gameboy version of Waterworld, again only released in Europe. In this version, the game starts with a slideshow of wonderful pixel art that introduces us to Waterworld and the conflict between the smokers and the atollers. The game opens with a level that is mostly swimming, navigating the mariner around the underwater world, avoiding attacking fish and other sea life as you collect ammo, health, and starfish, while seeking the end of the stage. In Stage 3, you are introduced to a small section that allows you to run and swing around in an underwater cavern, which is a very natural way of introducing the platforming gameplay to the gamer. Unlike the Super NES version, the underwater and above water gameplay are integrated into the same stages, and the mariner can seamlessly transition between swimming and platforming. The other form of gameplay has you guiding the trimaran through the labyrinth of the Atoll, avoiding mines and ambushing jet skis while collecting missile and energy barrels to aid in your quest. However, I have to point out, does it seem like the sail is going the wrong direction on the trimaran? Trimaran levels are followed by platforming levels upon the Atoll, in which you have to collect ammunition to take out smokers as you progress to the end of each stage. As you advance through the game, levels will alternate between trimaran gameplay and Atoll platforming gameplay. All levels have a ticking clock, and it is necessary in the platforming levels to collect more time if you are ever to make it to the end of the various stages. Collecting hearts replenishes your health, and collecting 100 starfish will reward you with an extra life. Each platforming level is capped off by a unique boss battle that introduces challenges like dodging sharks, defeating giant smokers that toss barrels, eliminating these turret guys, and, of course, battling the Deacon himself. And I have to say, of the released Waterworld video games, this is by far my favorite. It is old school hard, and towards the end of the game, each stage needs to be perfected in order to beat it. But the game varies up the levels enough to keep things interesting. For example, some levels are very swimming based, others are very acrobatics based, and there's even this level towards the end of the game that is an all-out sprint to the end without even a single smoker enemy in the way. I used the game's one cheat code to skip over stages that I had already beaten. I have beaten every stage in the game, though I can't imagine completing the entire game in a single go as it is intended. The controls are great though, and the graphics are sharp, and the music is passable. All in all, Waterworld on the Game Boy is the hidden gem among all these releases. The final release game to come out at the same time as the movie's release was Waterworld for the Virtual Boy, which was released exclusively in North America. In this game, you captain the trimaran in a 3D world and attempt to save the Atollers from an onslaught of smokers. For those of you not familiar with the Virtual Boy, it is a Nintendo-developed video game console that displays stereoscopic 3D graphics through a head-mounted display, which only renders in red monochrome. The game actually plays a lot like the 1970s arcade classic Asteroids, with its multi-directional shooting and endless waves of enemies. But rather than viewing the action from top-down perspective, your view is centered at ocean level behind the trimaran. The game is set among the ruins of the Atoll, with the Atollers swimming for their lives. Smokers on jet skis come swooping in from all directions to capture the defenseless Atollers. It is your mission to fire upon the smokers and keep them from dragging the Atollers off into the distance. Atollers can be rounded back up by sailing over them, which sends them back into the center of the playing zone. In later levels, new enemies are introduced, like smoker boats and hunter sharks. Points are awarded for shooting enemies, and bonus points are given for the number of Atollers saved. Additional bonuses are given for saving all the Atollers, surviving the wave of enemies, and saving Enola, which gives you an Enola multiplier. The game ends when all your lives are gone, or if all the Atollers are captured. And while Waterworld on the Virtual Boy is generally regarded as the worst of the 22 games released on the system, it is actually not that bad if you look at it as an updated adaptation of the arcade classic that inspired it. It also has the interesting distinction of being the only movie tie-in game on the Virtual Boy. In an interview with Planet Virtual Boy, game designer Steve Wojta claimed that the game had more ambitious elements that were cut from the retail version, like water effects and a two-player mode, which took advantage of a never-released link cable that would see players in head-to-head jet ski battles. The released game does have 9-player multiplayer, but it's just alternating one player at a time of the main game. And I need to mention one last thing about this game. Like the Super NES version, the music is fantastic. The final, officially released Waterworld game is Waterworld: The Quest for Dryland for PC. The game was actually released in 1997, 2 years after the film's release, due to a turbulent production, which I've talked about in my Atoll Enforcer action figure review, but which I'll cover again in more detail here. The Quest for Dryland, developed by Interplay Entertainment, started as a very different game than the one released in stores. The game was originally in development for PlayStation 1, 3DO Interactive Multiplayer Game Console, and possibly macOS and even Atari Jaguar as well, as an on-rail shooter similar to that of Star Wars Rebel Assault. The game would use pre-rendered 3D backgrounds with enemy sprites laid on top of what was essentially video. However, after a year of development, the game was deemed an unplayable mess and dull to look at because of its flat 360-degree ocean environment. The game was cancelled. However, a preview for the game was released on a 3DO demo disc, as seen here. The same video was also released on a preview CD for the Atari Jaguar as well. The game underwent a major overhaul and became a 3/4 top-down perspective real-time strategy game. In the game, you play as the war chief and lead a pack of Atoll soldiers to defend their atoll and raid rival atolls in order to improve their supplies of hydro, food, weapons, and critical information. The war chief outfits his task force with weapons and armor needed for the mission ahead. Additionally, the Atoll warriors can pick up supplies from defeated enemies or rations that are strewn about the atolls. Resource management is a key element to this game. The game's plot occurs before the events of the film and sees the war chief and his troops doing battle with rival gangs such as the Laymen and the Organos, and of course, the Smokers. Towards the end of the game, a device called the Eye of God, a comically large satellite navigation device, is discovered, and the elders of the atoll hope to use it to find the fabled dry land. What is perhaps most remarkable about Waterworld: The Quest for Dryland is how the game's plot is told to the gamer. While partially laid out in journal entries which give additional information about the Waterworld universe, the game also splices in live-action cutscenes to further the narrative. Using the same video encoding techniques that Interplay developed for the pre-rendered backgrounds of the defunct on-rail shooter game, the dev team was able to compress these live-action videos onto the CD-ROM. And it is no doubt that these live-action cutscenes are a real treasure for Waterworld fans. Not only do the videos reuse props, sets, and footage from the film, but also 4 members of the original cast reprise their roles. Sort of. R.D. Call again plays the Atoll Enforcer, giving the war chief briefings before each mission. Zakes Mokay comes back as the poised Atoll Elder, delivering a rousing speech before the final attack on the Smokers. Jack Keller reprises his role as the watchful, yet eccentric tallyman of the Atoll. And ironically, John Fleck, who played the Deacon's doctor in the original film, plays the ever-philosophizing and inventive Gregor, who was originally played by Michael Jeter, but who was unavailable at the time of the game's production. And the game ends with 2 different scenarios. one where the Atollers discover the mythic dryland, and one where they do not, and Gregor sails off into the endless horizon. And I must, at this point, thank you, John Abbott of the Unheard Nerd, who originally uploaded the live-action videos from Waterworld: The Quest for Dryland to YouTube. You, sir, have greatly contributed to the Waterworld fandom by uncovering these lost treasures. Let us now move on to the fascinating unreleased games, starting with the most well-known, Waterworld for the Sega Genesis, or Mega Drive as it's known outside of North America. It is extremely surprising that this game was never released, as the game is nearly or wholly finished, and we know this because a complete version was leaked to the internet and is even playable in a web browser. And while on the surface the version may look very similar to the Super NES version, it actually differs in many aspects. The game opens with a text scroll that sets up the world and the fight for survival among its inhabitants. You assume the role of the mariner, but you seem more like a mercenary in this game, with the Atollers rewarding you with supplies after each successful mission. You are less of a hero here, and there's almost no mention of Helen or Enola. Like the Super NES version, the game is divvied up into 3 different gameplay styles. Navigating the trimaran, you protect various different atolls from attacking smokers that pilot jet skis, barges, fan boats, and even seaplanes. Jet skis jump over the walls of the atolls and abduct helpless atollers inside. You take them out with various weapons at your disposal, such as mines and harpoons, and rescue the poor atollers. Points are rewarded for rescuing atollers, destroying smokers, and deducted for any drowned or captured atollers. In the diving levels, you will have to maneuver through underwater caverns collecting mostly dirt, but also a few other random items. Unlike the Super NES version, there is a huge diversity of enemies that include eels, jellyfish, sharks, squids, blowfish, crabs, and even smokers. Luckily, in this version, you have your trusty harpoon gun to help hack through the mutant sea creatures. In this version, there's also a timer when underwater, and I can definitely confirm that this is an oxygen level, since you can replenish this bar by inhaling bubbles from these vents. Dirt and other items collected in these diving levels can be used to trade at the atolls for repairs and provisions to aid in your quest. In the platforming atoll levels, you will run and jump along various levels of scaffolding, blasting smokers with your harpoon gun while avoiding rolling barrels and falling flames. Emitted from the Sega Genesis version are any of the climbing and swinging mechanics found in its Super NES counterpart. While traversing the platforms of the atoll, you will collect ammunition, health, and stars, which are the only way you can score points in these sections and only give you a measly 100 points apiece. You can also collect these shields, which give you temporary invincibility and invisibility, which may be a glitch or an unfinished element in the game. The platforming levels end when you have met your smoker kill quota, which may be another underdeveloped gaming mechanic in this unreleased game. After 10 stages, each of which has a secret code, the game ends with an invasion of the D's. After you've killed your quota of 14 smokers on the D's, you are awarded with this image of Helen and Enola, the one reference to them in the entire game. The music is not the masterpiece on display as with the Super NES version, but it is still pretty good in a more arcadey style. All in all, I would say that the Sega Genesis version is about equal to, or perhaps a little less than the Super NES version in all aspects of the game, besides the underwater levels, which introduce a lot of cool enemies and the use of your harpoon gun. It actually feels like a lot of attention to detail was poured into these aspects of the game. The unreleased and cancelled games for the PlayStation, 3DO, macOS, and Atari Jaguar I already covered earlier in this video, so I'll not go over them again in this section. Supposedly, a version for the Sega 32X, the 32-bit add-on gaming console for the Sega Genesis, was rumored, but nothing is known of this version, so it may very well have never gone into production. This leaves us with one last unreleased game, the fabled Sega Saturn version. With the unreleased Saturn version of Waterworld, we may find the most ambitious and innovative game on this list. However, we will never know for sure as the game has never been played by anyone outside of the game's developers. The game was created by the same team that developed the Virtual Boy game, and probably had similar gameplay with you piloting the trimaran and doing battle with your smoker foes. In the interview with Steve Wojta from Planet Virtual Boy, he claims that the Saturn version was really the definitive version of the game that the team had sought to make. Boasting full 3D graphics, the water in the game was the best that had ever been created up until that point. The trimaran had an arsenal of weapons at its disposal in this version, including projectile saw blades that would skim along the water until they faded into the horizon. While only still frames exist of the actual gameplay of this version of the game, a supposedly pre-rendered animated intro video for the game has been uploaded to the internet. While it was not 100% confirmed that this was a part of the game, I do have my own theory for what this footage actually is. In order to create the sprites for the Virtual Boy game, 3D models were designed on a silicone graphics supercomputer and captured from multiple angles to make the sprites look as if they are rotating, and then converted into shades of red for the Virtual Boy's limited color palette. However, after they created the game sprites, they still had all of these high-quality 3D assets left over. These 3D assets were then used to create the intro video for the Saturn version. They were also used to create the promotional material for the Virtual Boy, like this fold-out poster from Nintendo Power, as well as the game's actual packaging. Getting back to the cancelled Sega Saturn version, it appears that like the Genesis version, the game was completely finished. During this time, Ocean Software merged with Infogrames, but it was more like a corporate takeover in disguise, and this, for whatever reason, most likely led to Waterworld not going to a final release for Sega Genesis and Saturn. And unlike the Genesis version, the Saturn version has never been dumped onto the internet for both Sega Saturn and Waterworld fans to play and enjoy. Before I close out this video, I actually have one more officially released game to tell you about, and that of course is Universal Studios Theme Parks Adventure. Released in 2001 to the Nintendo GameCube, this title is a collection of mini-games based on the rides and attractions found at Universal theme parks. You navigate the theme parks through fixed camera angles, picking up trash in order to gain access to more mini-games. Featured mini-games include Back to the Future, Jaws, Jurassic Park, E.T., Backdraft, and of course, Waterworld. However, sadly, the Waterworld section is not so much a game, but rather a pre-rendered animation of the live show's finale, with the seaplane crashing into the pool of water. You can watch the 8-second animation from different angles, but that's the only choice you can make in this so-called minigame. Regardless, we're putting this on the list of official Waterworld video games. And there you have it, that's everything we know about the many video games of Waterworld. All in all, if you include all of the unreleased and rumored about vaporware games on this list, we have a total of 12 Waterworld video game titles. Some good, some bad, but all unique and bringing interesting visions of the Waterworld universe to the gamer's hand. This was a fairly hefty video for me to create, so if you enjoyed this deep dive, please consider subscribing to the channel. It's a great way to let me know that there's an audience out there that enjoys this kind of content. And thanks, as always, for joining me at the Atoll.